Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Lonnie. It's a pleasure to be here. Although, of course, the reason why I think I'm supposed to talk about the Gettysburg Address is because it's too resonant, as Andy said, in this turbulent period. People are really clinging to the creed of democracy, and Lincoln expressed it better than anybody. That's why this is a good text to teach, besides the fact that it's short and it's easy and everybody is familiar with some element of it. This is the text everybody needs to understand right now. It's the ballast we need in these stormy seas. That's at least how I teach it to the students in my classes, both at Dickinson and at the Knowledge for Freedom seminar. And I'll show you how I do that, and then we can talk about other ways to do it, or what it means to teach the Gettysburg Address, not only in this period of, political turbulence, but also on the eve of the 250th anniversary of the country. That should be a moment of great celebration, and it will be, I hope. Um, this is Lincoln's meditation on the meaning of national independence and freedom and equality. It's the reflection that he made about individualism and nationalism and how the two things have to serve each other. Let me share my screen and show you this presentation about the Gettysburg Address through the lens of teaching strategies that we use at the Knowledge for Freedom seminar. When we talk about close reading in a history class like the ones I teach, I focus students on a mantra. I talk about text, context, and subtext. Uh, it begins with understanding the words and the format of the text, but as a historian in particular, what makes my version of close reading, I think, special is historians love to understand context. They want to share and know more about the author and the audience background. Um, and then what I like to get students to focus on, and where I think they have the most interest ultimately, is in analyzing subtext, which is usually just a way of understanding that every author makes choices. All words are decisions. But the way I usually teach it is I tell my students, when you look at a text, ask yourself what the author left out, not just what he or she put in. And that's when you can argue about their intentions. And so that's what I want to do with the Gettysburg Address. Let's start with text. I'm not going to recite it from memory. Maybe Andy will do that later. Uh, it's a text we're all familiar with. It's 10 sentences. It's just about 272 words, but maybe one element of the text has escaped your notice. It's not as familiar as it should be. So the text that's on the wall of the Lincoln Memorial, the text that's in our textbooks, that's not the actual text that Lincoln delivered in November 1863 at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery at Gettysburg. That's a version that he wrote in March of 1864. We have 5 copies of the text of the Gettysburg Address in Lincoln's own handwriting. The first copy, at least most historians think the first copy began on a sheet of Executive Mansion stationery that you see on the screen to your right. The the stationery was the the kind of starting point. Lincoln finishes the draft of the text at Gettysburg itself, or rewrites it, might be a better way to put it. The differences between the first version and the last version, the 5 copies that we have in Lincoln's handwriting, are very small. Punctuation, a change of a word here or there, it would be totally recognizable from first to last to most people. But I think anybody who teaches writing or who appreciates writing knows every single small change matters, especially for somebody like Lincoln. We can talk more about those texts later if you want, but I wanted to focus on context. Um, so there's almost an infinite number of ways you can go when you teach context. You could talk about the war in this case, or you could talk about Lincoln. You can talk about funeral orations. You can talk about the politics of the Union coalition. But I've just written a book that's coming out next year called Boss Lincoln. It's about Lincoln as a party leader. And in my classes, I find that context on politics is the one that helps bring to life the Gettysburg Address the most. Because what most of my students don't realize, and what a lot of, I think, adults sort of trained in the myth of Lincoln don't appreciate is that when Lincoln delivered that Gettysburg Address in November of 1863, he wasn't focusing just on reuniting the nation. He was really pressed and focused almost grimly on unifying the North. You have to remember, this was a period of bitter division in the North, partisan division. Democrats opposed to Republicans, Republicans divided among themselves. By this point in the war, the Republicans had decided to rename themselves as the Unionists, and they were fighting over the future of this party. They were trying to work in coalition with some war Democrats, Democrats who supported the administration, and some conservatives, border state conservatives. Not every state in the Union during the middle of the Civil War was a free state. There were four slave states in the Union coalition. And so when Lincoln comes to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in November 1863, he arrives on the 18th and delivers his address on the 19th and then leaves that day. Uh, he is he is trying to reach a broad-based Northern audience with a message that will unify his Union Party and position him to run for re-election as president. And what makes that even more, interesting as context, and what almost none of my students realize, is that the reason why this is so imperative is because he's facing a rebellion from within his own cabinet, the so-called team of rivals. Well, one of those rivals was Salmon Chase, his Secretary of Treasury. In November of 1863, he's running for the nomination of the Union Party. And there's one little bit of rules context that really matters. You can appreciate this, I think. The process of elections was different back then. Midterm elections for Congress, they happened all across a period of about 18 months. So they didn't just occur in 1862, but there were congressional elections in 1863. There were state elections. And it was only after those elections in the fall of 1863, in October and November, that it was apparent that the Unionists were going to control the Congress and that Lincoln and his party were emerging as, the dominant force in the North. That's why Salmon Chase was vying for the nomination. He was saying this new unconditional Union Party is what he called it, and what his followers believed it should be, that they should embrace emancipation as their cardinal principle. But it was Lincoln and the National Unionists were holding them off, saying, this has to be a party organized around the principle of democracy, with emancipation as a policy, a method to achieve that goal, to secure the original election of 1860 and to deny the legitimacy of secession and to quash this rebellion. That's what they meant by saving the Union. So what do I have here on the screen in front of you? I have a picture of the platform at the ceremony on November 19th. It's a somber occasion, but it's also a political event, and it feels an awful lot like a party convention. It's a gathering of Northern politicians from all of the different states who had soldiers buried at Gettysburg. It was a mass of the administration and its supporters. You can sort of feel the climate from this picture, this detail of an image from the speaker's platform. I want to just point out some of the figures here to help you understand the background. The first figure listed there, that's Wayne McVeigh. He was the chairman of the Union Party of Pennsylvania. And he's standing there with Lincoln's two top aides. Figure number 2 is John Hay, and figure number 3 is John Nicolay. Nicolay, Hay, and McVeigh had traveled together up from Washington and spent the night on the 18th drinking and meeting with folks across Gettysburg in preparation for the ceremony. They were networking. There's Lincoln in the circle in the center. And then the blurry-faced figure number 4 next to him, that's William Seward, his Secretary of State. Salmon Chase, by the way, didn't bother to attend. His daughter had just gotten married the week before. He said he was too tired to come. But that's a quick difference between Lincoln and Chase as party leaders. Lincoln went to Chase's wedding. His wife, Mary, refused to go. She was upset by Chase's disloyalty. Lincoln shows up with a gift. And then he comes to Gettysburg and arrives the day before so he can spend more time with everyone. Chase wasn't so committed to face-to-face retail politicking like Lincoln was. But there's Seward next to him. And figure number five, in case you're wondering, that's the main orator at Gettysburg, Edward Everett. He was president of Harvard and a former Constitutional Union candidate for vice president in 1860, a conservative. But by this point in the war, he was a supporter of Lincoln's, and he explained why at the end of his oration about the battle. He spoke for about 2 hours. Lincoln spoke for about 2 minutes afterwards. This is probably a photograph that captures the period after Edward Everett had finished and just before Lincoln was about to take the podium. Figure number six was a leading editor, one of the most powerful newspaper men in the country named John Forney. He had been a Democrat who had become a Unionist. Figures number 7, 8, and 9 are governors. Figure number 7 is Andrew Curtin of Pennsylvania. He pulled an Elon Musk that day. If you look to his left, you see he brought his kid with him. Figure number 8 is Horatio Seymour, the Democratic governor of New York. And figure number 9 is David Todd, the Unionist governor of Ohio, former Democrat. Todd, number 9, and Curtin, number 7, had both been elected in October. Their victories were what made this moment a kind of a triumph for Lincoln. Now, there's a little bit of extra context here that I want to talk about. And that is, there was a story that Lincoln evokes at the end of his speech that I think his audience understood, but our students don't know about. And this, to me, humanizes the address in a way that almost no other story can. You're looking at a picture on the screen of a man named Sam Wilkeson. He was a leading war correspondent, a noted radical, supporter of, the idea that emancipation should be what the war was about. And he wrote for the New York Times. And he had a son who was actually in the battle at Gettysburg. He's pictured on the screen as well on horseback. He was a young artillery officer, about 19 years old. His name was Bayard Wilkeson. And he was wounded on the first day. His leg got shattered by an artillery shell, and he was left with prisoners that the Confederates captured. His leg needed amputation, but the Confederates didn't have medical personnel for their own troops, let alone for the prisoners of war. And so, according to the eyewitnesses who were there with him, on July 1st, 1863, at the end of the first day's battle, Bayard Wilkeson tries to amputate his own shattered leg, and he dies from shock that night. His father arrived that night with General Meade, who was the commander of the Union forces at Gettysburg. And then after the battle was over, it was July 4th, 1863, Sam Wilkeson goes looking for his son Bayard. He had heard he had been captured. And when he finally found him, it was, of course, his son's corpse. And he wrote his article, the coverage for the New York Times, seated next to his son's dead body. And the lead of the New York Times battle coverage begins like this: "Who can write the history of a battle whose eyes are immovably fastened upon a central figure of transcendingly absorbing interest, the dead body of an oldest born, crushed by a shell, in a position where a battery should never have been sent, and abandoned to death in a building where surgeons dared not stay." That's the questioning of an angry father who feels like his son's life has been wasted by incompetent military leadership. And the rest of the article is full of furious, dramatic descriptions of the heroic actions of the soldiers and the officers. And even though you could tell that Wilkeson was torn by the loss of life, he ends his piece, and this is the reason why I'm talking about it. He ends his piece by saying that the sacrifices were worth it. He writes, "My pen is heavy. Oh, you dead who at Gettysburg have baptized with your blood the second birth of freedom in America, how you are to be envied." Now, it created a sensation. They called this Sam Wilkeson's thrilling word picture of Gettysburg. They reprinted this across the North. Abraham Lincoln knew the Wilkeson family. Um, they were a very prominent family. It was a remarkably well-known story. And to me, this is also, an example of context, a subtext. When Lincoln ends his address, he evokes the memory of the Wilkeson family. We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, he said, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. Lincoln's new birth of freedom is his paraphrase of Wilkeson's second birth of freedom in America. Lincoln doesn't say anybody's name in the Gettysburg Address. He doesn't mention anything specific. He doesn't use words like union or emancipation. It's abstract poetry. But the reason why it works is because it's evocative. He evokes the Bible 7 years ago. He evokes the Declaration of Independence. And here he's evoking the most dramatic human story of the battle for his Northern audience. And it has one other partisan element that I'll squeeze in there, although this is not something everybody needs to teach to their students, but it's in my book, and I think it's really powerful. Um, Sam Wilkeson was a radical, but he had turned into a Lincoln supporter. And in fact, according to Lincoln's aide, John Hay, Wilkeson told him in the days before the Gettysburg Address, he was working behind the scenes to get Lincoln endorsed as the nominee for the Union Party. This was a big deal because they would have thought somebody like Wilkeson was a Chase supporter. But Chase wasn't strong enough to lead the coalition, according to some of the radicals, and that's why they began moving in Lincoln's direction. Chase's campaign is going to fizzle out very shortly. He wasn't even at this convention, as you might call it. And Lincoln's evocation of Wilkeson is not just human, it's also partisan. He's trying to bring together conservatives like Everett and radicals like Wilkeson in this stronger coalition. That's subtext. That's, the hidden meaning of some of the decisions that authors make. In this case, it's a literary one. Before I stop talking, I want to show you two examples of subtext from people who challenged Lincoln immediately afterwards. One is Frederick Douglass. He was worried that by Lincoln's abstractions, new birth of freedom instead of emancipation or abolition, that Lincoln was backing away from his commitment to, more aggressive policies against slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation, if you remember, had been announced on January 1st, 1863. It's a year later, slaves are being freed, but there's a chance that slavery won't be abolished. And so in middle of January in New York, at a gathering of the Women's Loyal League, which was headed by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, by the way, was Bayard Wilkeson's aunt. Her sister was his mother. They host a meeting. They're sponsoring a patriotic movement of women, but they're supporting a 13th Amendment to the Constitution. They're organizing a petition drive to argue for the abolition of slavery. And they asked Douglass to speak about how it all comes together. And he calls his speech The Mission of the War. And this is what he says. It's not billed as a response to the Gettysburg Address, but you can tell he's disturbed by the absence of commitment. And he wants to make clear that what Lincoln wouldn't say at Gettysburg, he's saying here in New York in January. I end where I began, he says. No war but an abolition war. No peace but an abolition peace. Liberty for all, chains for none. The black man a soldier in war, a laborer in peace, a voter at the South as well as at the North. America his permanent home, and all Americans his fellow countrymen. This is Douglass saying, the radical, the former slave, saying no new birth of freedom. Let's put the words abolition into our mouths and let's make this war about the end of slavery. That same week, there was another response to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. This one was more direct, and it was by a woman who was only 21 years old. Her name was Anna Dickinson. You're looking at a picture of her there. This might be the most powerful story for some of our students because it's been totally forgotten. Frederick Douglass, they know, but Anna Dickinson, they've never heard of. She was 21 years old, and she was invited to give an address to a joint session of Congress. She's the first woman in American history to give a political address to a joint session of Congress. She'd become famous during the war as an orator for the Unionists, a patriotic orator. She came from an abolitionist family in Pennsylvania. She was a radical, just like Douglas, but she was also a patriot. And there was a question, whether these radicals were going to support Chase or Lincoln. Douglas doesn't commit to anybody in January, but there's a rumor that Dickinson's going to commit. And so Lincoln goes to the joint session of Congress on January 16th and sits there in the audience while this 21-year-old woman criticizes his administration, but then ends up endorsing him. She begins by saying what Douglas said. She talks about what she calls the perils of the hour, not the mission of the war, but she says it was for liberty. For what did they fight, and for what had they died? She says, in order that, in the language of the president, good government might not perish from the earth. Now you'll notice the Gettysburg Address hasn't become the sacred creed yet. She's misunderstanding, misremembering the phrase government of the people, by the people, for the people, and paraphrasing it as good government. In 1976, our independence was asserted, but 1861 was the beginning of liberty. Her point was that the war was about ending slavery. Same point as Douglas's, the point that Lincoln doesn't make clear enough in their view in the Gettysburg Address. But Anna Dickinson ends differently than Douglas did. She ends by endorsing Lincoln. The very end of her speech, she says, this was preeminently a people's war. It was guided by the man of the people. Granted that we have much yet to do, she said, we have the man to complete the grand and glorious work, and that work was left for his second term of office. According to Lincoln's aides, there was a burst of tremendous applause after this, and he seemed relieved that she had endorsed him. This is, I think, what causes the most useful debates among our students when they ask themselves how they would have responded to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, like Douglas, like Dickinson, or perhaps in a different fashion. And that's what we do at the Knowledge for Freedom seminar. All of this material, the gloss on the Gettysburg Address, Douglas's Mission of the War speech, Anna Dickinson's Perils of the Hour speech, they're all at this website that we've created for the Knowledge for Freedom seminar at Dickinson. That program, our course texts, multimedia resources, video tutorials, all of it is online, open, and free. So if anybody is interested in following through on maybe trying to teach the Gettysburg Address in some form or fashion, like I just introduced, or using Douglas or Dickinson as part of a lesson on the Gettysburg Address, all of that material is available freely to you and accessible online. So let me stop my share and pull back and see if Andy or Lonnie want to comment, or if people want to start to ask some questions or make some comments using the chat. Now would be a good time for us to have some discussion.
Matt, thanks a million, and I'm gonna seize the opportunity also because again I have to leave early today. Maybe while people are thinking about what they want to pose, two thoughts, sort of questions that I'd be grateful if you would comment a little more on. You've called our attention to many issues, but the two that come to my mind immediately. One is how to encourage students to grapple with the quandary or the problem that a politician like Lincoln was of the view that if he didn't consolidate the Union coalition, there might be no victory over the Confederacy, and there might then be a long future for the institution of slavery. I think that's implied in your remarks, and that therefore he made the choice not to speak directly about slavery, one of the words that does not appear in the Gettysburg Address, not to use the word abolition, as you pointed out. And in my experience, a lot of students are not just puzzled, but angry about that. I remember a student once asking me, how could I expect her to respect this president who never confronts the issue of slavery directly in this famous American speech? So I wonder, you've already spoken about that, of course, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more about whether you encounter that resistance among your students and what you do with it. And then the second thing, which is both a problem and an opportunity, it seems to me, is that you're asking in the way that you've just done, you're saying, look, here's a short text. Let's think about the text. Let's think about the subtext. Let's think about the context. Let's take it seriously as a work, and as you say, in which every word is a decision. A great phrase. Now, you're talking to students who have never heard a political speech that even begins to compare in subtlety or complexity with this one from either party, right? And whose notion of public communication is the tweet or something that's written by AI or a soundbite or a slogan. So how do you get your students to understand what oratory once meant in our culture and how powerful it could be and how maybe we're the poorer for the fact that we don't have it anymore? I don't know if those two questions make any sense or are related to another, but if you want to talk about that a little bit more, I'd be
Right.
grateful.
Okay, so of course Andy's right. Lincoln was a pragmatist, okay? And our students, you can understand, you're 18 years old, pragmatism isn't very attractive. But in our seminar, we've set it up so it's like a debate between Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. They share the same goals, they share many of the same values, but they differ over strategy. And so we talk to the students about the difference between reform and radicalism, between partisan politics and protest politics, between somebody like Lincoln, who's a pragmatist, and somebody like Douglas, who's more of a provocateur, right? And they both have their roles, but our students have to appreciate that elections matter. And if there was ever a moment in American life when they should see, heading into the 250th anniversary, that elections matter, there's a big difference between having Donald Trump as president and having Kamala Harris as president. You can say that without choosing sides in a political debate. But it's clear, right, that elections matter. That's what Lincoln would say to Anna Dickinson or Frederick Douglass or Andy to your student. He would say, your principles won't win this election. We have to have the Edward Everetts on the platform who are conservative, and we have to have the radicals like Douglass and Dickinson and Wilkeson together. And that's not easy. And that's why sometimes you have to you have to blur the differences, and sometimes you have to sharpen other differences. You make choices, you set priorities. That's the pragmatist credo. Now, Lincoln offers the pragmatist credo with more power and inspiration than anybody else in American history. That's another reason why he's good to teach, because most of our students just have no respect for pragmatism. And they don't have to be pragmatic, but they have to have respect for it. That's my opinion. Now, Andy, I've lost track. What was your second point?
Well, no, that's a great answer. The second question was just how do you get them to recognize that uh, oratory of at this level once existed in our culture, and that people turned out to hear it and took it seriously and weighed every word and argued over the words. How do you get the students to kind of tune in to this kind of speech making when they live in a culture where it doesn't exist?
Right. So, all of us are struggling to get students to read. It's hard for them to focus. Um, Lincoln would actually be fine on Twitter. He would work on social media. You could take the Gettysburg Address and make tweets out of it. It would be perfectly good. Um, so my point to my students is, the format, the platforms, they change, they evolve, but the power of words is enduring. And if you don't appreciate it from listening to Trump or Biden or Harris, then like you just suggested, you can appreciate it from reading Lincoln and others. That's why we have to push them to study great writers and to read them. Um, there are, people who write great sentences, and there are great writers today. There are there are orators who sometimes hit a moment in American life, even in 2025. Um, and our students have to be prepared to appreciate that, and hopefully some of them can become those orators and writers themselves. That's what we have to keep the faith about.
That's great. Thanks so much, Matt. And I think we got some questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to thank you again. And in a few minutes, I'm going to have to sign off, but appreciate it very much. And thank you all for coming to this. So, Lonnie, are you going to take over the Q&A moderation?
Yes, and there is actually a wonderful question in the Q&A connected to what we're talking about the place of oratory in our culture, um, you know, and sort of linking the Gettysburg Address to the tradition of funeral orations in particular, going back to Pericles, for example. So, the question is that something that you do? Would that open up inquiry too wide? Are there useful insights to be gained by linking Lincoln and Pericles in a larger oratory tradition for students today?
Yeah, of course. Um, if you're interested in understanding the Gettysburg Address in the context of funeral orations, the best book on that subject was by Gary Wills, whose book Lincoln at Gettysburg is easy to read and perfect material for teaching in the classroom. Lincoln himself encountered figures like Pericles and other funeral orations in a book called The Columbian Orator, which is available on Google Books right now if anybody wants to see it. But the reason I bring it up and the reason why it's so powerful is because the Columbian Orator was kind of like a standard school book in American life in the 19th century. And it was the first book that Frederick Douglass ever purchased. He was 12 years old. He was being hired out as a slave in Baltimore. Hiring out slaves meant that um, one owner would rent his slave to another owner. And usually, when a slave was hired out to encourage good behavior, the masters, the owners, would give them a little percentage, like a gratuity or a kickback on the fee. And so Douglas accumulated 50 cents as a 12-year-old boy. He went out to a bookstore in the Inner Harbor and he purchased the Columbian Orator. And so Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass both used the same text to learn how to read, write, and speak. They came to different conclusions about, how to address certain issues, but you can see the inspiration that these funeral orations and other great speeches from across history mattered to them, how they learned by reading. And it's a perfect model of inspiration for our own students. And the last, beautiful footnote to that story, if anybody ever has the opportunity to go to Washington, D.C., the volume of the Columbian Orator that Douglas purchased is still in existence. It's at his Frederick Douglass home site, run by the National Park Service in Washington, D.C.
Oh my God, I had no idea. That's amazing. Okay. Well, uh, some a question that I was thinking about, so you have the advantage because of your location in Pennsylvania to take your students to Washington, D.C., to take your students to Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. Um, what are, for faculty who just don't have that kind of geographic proximity, are there digital artifacts that you like to use or that you can suggest that might help sort of give students access to these types of resources, even if they're based in California or Hawaii or Montana, that come to mind
Yep.
for you?
Of course, that's the advantage of the digital world is everything seems to be at your fingertips with multimedia resources online. You can accomplish an awful lot that you can never accomplish before. I'll throw out a couple of suggestions. These are all available through the Knowledge for Freedom seminar website that I showed you. But like we created at the House Divided Project at Dickinson College an exhibit online for Google on the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. That was where I first encountered and developed the story of Sam Wilkeson and his son Bayard. But in that exhibit, we have all five versions of the Gettysburg Address in Lincoln's handwriting and the story behind each one. The exhibit is called Lincoln's Gettysburg Addresses. You can Google it. It's from Google Arts, but we also have it at the Gettysburg Address resource page at the Knowledge for Freedom site that I showed you. And so students can look at Lincoln's handwriting. These are documents that are on places like it's at the White House at the Lincoln Bedroom or at Cornell University Library. They're scattered all over the country. One is in Springfield, Illinois, at his presidential library. You're not going to be able to touch them and hold them in real life, but you can see them on the screen in living color. It's pretty powerful. I did a video tour of the Battle of Gettysburg for the Gilder Lehrman Institute. It's like a 1 hour teacher's tour broken up into different segments. I have a segment on the Wilkesons at the cemetery. I have another segment on different soldiers and their, stories, segments on the battle. And the video takes, participants, viewers through the battlefield. You can see the landscape. It's supplemented with other multimedia resources. That's also available, through our Knowledge for Freedom seminar website. That story that I told you about Anna Dickinson, part of the reason why her story is so obscure is because there was never a full text of that speech. And believe it or not, one of my undergraduate students found, using digital searching, a full text version that was reprinted in one of the Washington newspapers that had somehow been overlooked by scholars for years. So everybody knew she gave the speech, and people had partial coverage of it, but the full details were kind of missing. She didn't have a text of the speech that she had written that was available in her papers. Somehow it got destroyed. And so my student, using digital searching through the Library of Congress's Chronicling America website, which is all free and open, she stumbled onto this discovery. And now if you go to the resource page on Anna Dickinson and the Perils of the Hour speech, you can access this student-produced website that shows the full text of the speech and has it transcribed. Again, like, these are the kind of little details that certain students, certain teachers are going to find really compelling. They bring things to life. I've seen lots of teachers do all kinds of three-dimensional field trips, virtual field trips. I just did a presentation with Ford's Theater. They do a great job with all kinds of virtual programming. We could list, an endless array of resources online to help bring these stories to life if people are interested.
Thank you so much. I tried to put links as you were speaking, the links that you're referring to in the chat. And so I think, these are going to be really useful for those of us who are with us in the webinar, if you could take a look. So something that I was thinking about, I imagine that the Gettysburg Address, it's taught a lot in public speaking courses. It's taught a lot potentially in writing courses, in addition to sort of history, right? And so, I was just curious, at the start of the webinar, you made the point about how there are small variations in the 5 versions of the Gettysburg Address on its way to being inscribed in marble, right? And they're sort of drawing students' attention to these differences in such a short speech, when the placement of each word and even perhaps each punctuation mark matters. Can you talk us through how you help students really do that close read and notice the differences, and how that help, how do you use that to help them think about their own writing process? And then in the context of, perhaps a public speaking course, do you have students read the text to their peers? How do you kind of talk about this as a public speaking exercise?
Okay, so the single greatest way to demonstrate you're a Lincoln expert, especially with the Gettysburg Address, is that in the first two handwritten copies, the one I showed you on the screen that started on the Executive Mansion stationery, and then another draft that some historians think was actually the speaking copy, the phrase "under God" does not appear in Lincoln's handwriting. That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. That phrase "under God" did not appear until the final three copies, including the last one from March 1864, that's on the wall of the Lincoln Memorial. So those are two words that were added to the speech at some point by Lincoln. And this is a classic example of how important those two words are. Did he add them as he was speaking in an attempt to invoke God or religious faith? Or, as some historians suspect, did one of the reporters, one of the AP reporters, add that phrase in just kind of as a platitude? And Lincoln saw it afterwards and thought, oh, that's smart. I'm going to put that in there because Lincoln didn't belong to a church. He wasn't an evangelical Christian during an era when Christianity was so powerful. He believed in God, and he evoked God in his speeches, most famously the second inaugural address. But his relationship to religion was complicated. And so this is a subtext question. What did he mean by adding that phrase? Was he being defensive? Was he being proactive? Was he trying to send a message about faith? And students can easily debate that just by focusing on that level of detail in a speech like the Gettysburg Address. And then when it comes to oratory and the meaning of words, I do constantly repeat the mantra to my students that words are decisions, and word choice is the essential strategy of any good writer. I mean, all of you on a program like this know that, but we have to look for ways to demonstrate it to students that choosing one word over another makes all the difference. And all of us have our favorite text to do that, but mine is the Gettysburg Address.
The one question in the Q&A, when you're talking to students, okay, so how do you talk to students about how the Gettysburg Address changed ideas about what America is? So how do you sort of help students?
Right. So
think through
that's a very popular approach to teaching this address. This is what Gary Wills argued in his book Lincoln at Gettysburg. He said they're the words that remade America. And he talked about how Lincoln took a country that was fixated on debates about the Constitution and kind of stole the Declaration of Independence into the argument in order to make it more about all men being born equal and to promote the idea of a new birth of freedom. The Constitution seems to be more about a frame of government and a balance of powers, and Lincoln is trying to reignite the spirit of individualism and natural rights. I am more skeptical of that argument. I don't think this speech remakes America. I know that we love it and we should, but I wrote a book that's coming out called Boss Lincoln, The Partisan Life of Abraham Lincoln. My argument in that book is that no speech makes anybody president, and that words are important and they matter, but behind the scenes activities matter as well. Like I could run through a litany of things that Lincoln did before and after the Gettysburg Address that had an enormous impact on his success and the ultimate victory in the war, when paired together with his eloquent words in the Gettysburg Address and other speeches or public letters. He was so good because he did the the public communication and the private communication. And most people, most politicians are good at one or the other. He was good at both. But I don't think words are enough to remake America. It has to be in combination with a whole host of factors. And I think we tend to overestimate the power of words to remake America in a great speech because they're easy to find. You know, part of I would hope that I introduce new context to the Gettysburg Address to most people. I mean, even Andy, I would hope learned something from this presentation. And that's because, the behind the scenes stuff, the background stuff always gets lost. Um, and we need to do a better job of trying to balance because it's not just about text. It's about understanding texts in the context of their times. You have to try to do both. And so, we need to just strive, especially now in this digital age when we have greater resources, we need to strive to create that balance for students so that they don't invest too much faith or hope in any particular word or speech, but they understand that politics is a process. This is the last thing I'll say to this, but our message in our Knowledge for Freedom seminar with the high school students is that, it's persistence that matters as much as anything else. And patience doesn't mean that you have to be passive. It means that you have to work and expect results to come slowly in a democracy that's as big and as turbulent and as divided as ours.
Very pragmatic, right?
Yeah, channeling the inner Lincoln pragmatism and just getting students to appreciate it, even as they, find when we do Lincoln Douglas debates, they always favor Douglas. Douglas wins repeatedly, but that's fine, especially for 18-year-olds. But they need to respect pragmatism too. And Douglas himself and most radicals are pragmatic at different times. They have to be in order to achieve success.
Well, you mentioned Douglas, you mentioned Wilkinson. Are there other speeches that you teach alongside the Gettysburg Address? There's a question about whether you teach Everett's speeches in the Q&A.
So Everett's speech was 2 hours. He was a well-respected orator at the time, but he's an example of somebody who doesn't travel well into the 21st century. We have over 30 texts available online through our seminar that we teach, everything from, Aristotle through to modern day poetry. We do a lot of different things with poems. In particular, poems are really good documents because they're like the Gettysburg Address. They're short. So we teach a poem like by Phyllis Wheatley in 1773, and then we use other poets to try to create a different track or depth. It's not exactly like these are responses to the Gettysburg Address, but these are different authors reaching different audiences, addressing the kind of recurring eternal questions that Lincoln raised in the Gettysburg Address, like about what does freedom mean and how can democracy promote freedom? Those are always challenging questions, but they're important ones and they recur throughout American history.
Are there other, in addition to the poems that you mentioned, are there other texts that you found to be not as short and as impactful as teaching the
Okay.
Gettysburg?
So I'm glad you pushed me a little bit on that because my personal favorite and what I use in the seminar and in my own classes is letters. And one of the biggest differences between Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln was that Douglas would say something in public that Lincoln would only say in private. And so I teach Lincoln's private letters in the 1850s complaining about the fugitive slave law. But he says, I bite my lip and keep quiet because we have to hold the Union together. While Douglas is out there at the same time, and I have my students compare the public speech to the private letter, he's out there at the same time saying, we don't need the gentle rain, we need thunder and lightning. And he wants to bring, retribution for the sin of slavery and the horrors of the fugitive slave law. And Lincoln is convinced that too much thunder and lightning will drown out any hopes of winning elections. And so he stifles some of his anger, and he has anger that he expresses in his letters about the hypocrisy of Americans and how they betrayed their declaration. He knows what Douglas knows. It's not like he's ignorant. but he has a different strategy for overcoming it. And I think that's why they respected each other. Douglas and Lincoln had great respect for each other, even though they disagreed. And it was a disagreement over strategy, not over principles. And I think that's ultimately what bound them together. And our students should appreciate that too.
Related to that, you made the point earlier that both Lincoln and Douglas, they were both sort of students of the Columbian reader, right? The Columbian
Columbian orator. And I
orator.
have some examples of that at the seminar website as well.
Well, I was curious about what are other texts that both of them would have been familiar with.
Well, of course, the
What were
the
they reading?
central text in American life was the Bible, and they both read the Bible and considered it. Lincoln was not an Orthodox Christian; he didn't belong to a church, and Douglas was furious over how some churches endorsed and supported slavery, and so he was willing to attack the organized religion in the way that very few people were. But they were both profoundly faithful in their own ways. And you can't talk about American history without addressing faith. And of course, that's another thing that's happening now is, church attendance is down, synagogue attendance is down. Um, the the public attitudes toward religious faith are changing in the 21st century. So these become good discussion points in classes that want to venture into this territory. Too many teachers are afraid to, engage and talk about religious life. But we've been finding in the Knowledge for Freedom seminar, it can be some of the richest discussions because you get a range of different student experiences with religion, but sometimes across like a big divide in culture, they share a common faith, and that can be unifying to some, especially if they can talk about differences respectfully.
And what are some strategies that you use in the classroom to encourage that respectful
So
dialogue?
my mantra is
Like, what does the table
democracy.
do? Yeah.
My mantra is democracy is not the Greek word for perfect. Um, it's it's not a place where conversations are easy or dialogue is friendly. It might be the Greek word for disagreement. The people disagree, and when they disagree, they have to debate. And you don't have to love the ideas or the people you're debating with, but you just have to show respect for the process. If we don't have democracy and we can't debate and disagree, then all that's left is what Lincoln described as secession, anarchy, and violence. And so that's why you should be able to talk about the most polarizing issues, whether it's Trump versus Harris or the current debates over Israel and Gaza on college campuses, whatever it is. You should be able to say, look, we have to be able to have conflict within consensus. That's another phrase from the past, but it's something that Lincoln stands for. The idea that, you know, we have majorities and minorities, and people are going to debate these things, but if they can resolve them through elections, then we can avoid violence. If ballots are better than bullets. And so in my classrooms, I try to model that and emulate it and promote it, and it doesn't always work, you know. Uh, these are very polarized times, but I think it's worth trying, and I think it usually succeeds.